I think it's those themes of the perseverance of rugged individualism for both men and women, combined with the imperfect nature of being a human being and not always having a happy ending, that makes Casablanca such a great story. Not to mention the great quotes which make us remember the movie, make it fun to remember. Quotes like, "Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine," or "Here's looking at you, kid," or "Round up the usual suspects," or "Play it again, Sam." Which, by the way, was never a line in the movie. Ilsa says, "Play it, Sam. Play as time goes by." Then, when Rick wants to hear the song again, he says, "Play it." And he says it to Sam, but he never says, "Play it again, Sam," even though Sam plays it again, and again, and again. And this leads us to a unique overlap between Casablanca and Citizen Kane. The song, As Time Goes By, acts as a bridge, two bridges actually. It's a bridge between Ilsa and Rick as they both use the song to remember the other person. But it's also a bridge between the present and the past. You see, in the second act, a good amount of the story is told in flashback. We see Rick and Ilsa back in Paris falling in love. And while that may seem like a simple storytelling device now, in the 1940s, it was quite unorthodox. That, my friends, is a non-linear story. And stories usually weren't told out of order back then, except for a film that came out the year before, Citizen Kane. You see, Citizen Kane starts with the death of Charles Foster Kane. This death begins a mystery, a reporter's search for the meaning of Kane's dying words, "Rosebud." A similar technique is used by Martin Scorsese in Raging Bull, bookending the film in the present with the entire rest of the film told in flashback. American Beauty, same thing. Also, Saving Private Ryan and Life of Pi. All great movies, all using the same technique initiated by Citizen Kane. Of course, flashbacks are common in the theater, and you can start to see the influences when you realize that Casablanca was adapted from a stage play. And Orson Welles, the director of Citizen Kane, was a theater director before he became a film director. I mean, the history of storytelling is ages old. Characters and settings, plot, metaphor, theme. These ideas are expressed in song and literature, in poetry, and in plays. Stories throughout human history that allowed the audience's eye and ear to wander and to explore. And then came filmmaking, the art of storytelling through a lens. A new medium was born. The coin was flipped. And with that, let's take a look at the other side of that coin, Citizen Kane and the craft of making a great film. Citizen Kane was Orson Welles' directorial debut, but it wasn't his first foray into storytelling, not by a long shot. Even though he was only 25 years old at the time, Welles had an extensive resume as a producer and director of radio and stage plays. Before he directed Citizen Kane, he was well known for directing the 1938 broadcast of War of the Worlds. And the year before that, he founded the Mercury Theatre, which was famous for its cutting-edge reimaginations of Shakespearean classics. And this is from a kid in his 20s, which is important to know. It's important to understand because Welles was carrying these techniques, these storytelling techniques from radio and theater, and he was carrying them with him into filmmaking. At age 25, Welles had no problem casting himself as the lead, despite the fact that the role is a character who ages from his 20s well into his 70s. No problem, thought Welles. We'll just use makeup and rubber masks. Welles was fearless, and together with cinematographer Greg Toland, who was 36 years old at the time, they set off together to make filmmaking history. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds with the technical aspects of filmmaking here, but I think it's important for audiences today to really understand all the different techniques that Welles and Toland brought to the table back in the 1940s when they started filming Citizen Kane. Remember, there was a visual and auditory familiarity to films back then.
In the forest?
As I said before, most scenes were 3 or 4 minutes long. Actors would perform their lines one at a time, and when an actor spoke, they would typically say their line in medium or close-ups. And the shots were nearly always straight on, shot at eye level because if the camera were tilted up, the audience would see the lighting grid. And the audio in each scene was specific to the scene. There was no overlapping of sounds between scenes. When a scene began, the audio began. When a scene ended, the audio ended. Simple as that. Unless it was one of these long musical scores that was designed to illustrate the important emotion of that point in the story. In that case, the music might just sweep you away. Wells was about to change all of that. I'm going to not only walk you through 7 groundbreaking techniques that Citizen Kane introduced to filmmakers, but I'll also show you how other great filmmakers have subsequently used these techniques in their own films. The first technique, and probably one of the most widely heralded, is the use of universal focus, or an infinite depth of field, meaning that everything in the frame is in focus. This wasn't typically the case. Typically, your character would be in focus, and then the background drops off and is out of focus. This is called a shallow depth of field, and it tends to focus the audience's attention on what is in focus, typically the main actor who is speaking. But Wells came from theater, and in theater, the audience is able to focus their attention on anything that it's on the stage. And Wells wanted to use this technique in film to allow multiple messages to be delivered at any given time. For instance, in a famous scene from Citizen Kane, a woman is speaking to a lawyer in the living room. This is the main action of the scene. But in the next room behind them, a man is listening to their conversation. And further behind them still, a young boy is playing in the snow outside the window. The boy is the topic of the woman's conversation, and the audience is free to focus their attention on the woman, the man, or the boy, each at a different visual depth in the scene. This idea of universal focus is now routinely used in films to add complexity to a scene, and also to put the audience off guard psychologically as they're invited to weigh all of the options as the main character is weighing them himself. You see this technique in The Manchurian Candidate, Saving Private Ryan, and Zodiac. To complement his idea of universal focus to add depth to the image, Wells also developed this idea of deep sound, using various layers of audio to create a sense of depth. Yes, someone might be talking as the central point in the scene, but you might also be able to hear the sounds of a party in the next room. And fainter still, the sounds of the street off in the distance. Again, this offered the audience a depth and a variety of sound that added complexity to the story. Brian De Palma and the Coen brothers are filmmakers who often make use of deep sound techniques. The films Blowout, No Country for Old Men, and Barton Fink come to mind. But you can also find the same techniques in the French masterpiece Delicatessen, and the visually stunning Chinese action movie House of Flying Daggers.